So I am going to go on a long journey today. First, here's my intro slide. They told me to put a quote here, and I put the first thing that came to mind. So I just want to start by acknowledging that this is a very strange talk. And I want to frame exactly what I'm trying to do here because, you know, before having you join me on this long journey, I figure you should at least kind of know what you're in for. So I've been obsessed with finding answers and of making sense of the world for as long as I can remember. And I thought that I hit the jackpot when I was early career and I found a job as a data analyst because somebody was actually paying me to do what I love to do. But as my career progressed, I realized that it wasn't enough for me to know something. I've been a part of my fair share of organizations that I have felt when confronted with data, with sensory input from the outside world, they chose to do things that seemed very strange to me. And so it's always been something that I've wondered, like, what is the difference between the times when I've presented a recommendation that's made its way to action, and when one of the times when it doesn't. At first I saw this as a technical problem. We needed to do better analysis, more sophisticated analysis, faster, whatever. But I actually have gotten to a point where I think this is really wrong and even damaging in that it's hiding the real challenge. And this talk is me going on a journey to try to wrestle with this problem in real time. It's pulling ideas from all over the place, and I'm trying to specifically answer what are we, how do we know stuff? And so I'm going to start by proving to you that the human history of group dysfunction is a long and storied one. Let's start with a statement. Large groups of humans are stupider than individuals. That is probably the kind of thing that you identify with if you've ever tried to ask six friends where you should all go to dinner. I almost swore off having friends when I had one of those conversations one time because it could be so frustrating. Here's a metaphor that I use throughout this talk. Imagine that you're standing on train tracks and maybe it's dark outside and maybe you see off in the distance there's this one headlight coming for you and you hear a whistle and you're like 99% confident that there is a train coming down these tracks. What's the time lapse between when you realize that and when you actually move off the tracks? Well, for me, that time lapse is very short. It is like measured in single digit seconds. I'm getting the heck out of there. Now, imagine the same exact scenario, but there's a group of people that you're with. And, it's a contrived example. So, like, forget the fact that, like, why the heck are you standing on train tracks with all of these people? But you quickly realize that there's something different happening in this process of the group trying to move out of the way of the train versus the individual. You have to do something called generating consensus. And these are contrived silly examples, but it goes to show that generating consensus is not a trivial thing. You haven't been participating in the 2020 that I have if you disagree with that statement. So here's a very real life example of this happening. Many of us will be familiar with the story of Kodak. So there's an engineer at Kodak who worked there in 1975, and he invented the digital camera. He made the very first digital camera. And the story of Kodak in the ensuing 40 years looks something like that. And you can see that Kodak's failure to integrate this knowledge into, general consensus and then action for a little while didn't cause any problems. But then around 2000, when digital cameras started to become much more mainstream, this had a pretty negative impact. And then the real death knell was in 2007 with the launch of the iPhone, when people realized that film cameras were just not going to be broadly used in the future. So when I think of that story, I think of Kodak standing on a train track, being able to see that there was a train coming, and yet just kind of standing there and letting that train run it over. It turns out that human history is full of stories like this. This book, Collapse, is a book that I happened to read a couple years ago, and while it was, shall we say, maybe a little bit depressing to have the collective failure of humanity repeatedly thrust in one's face, so as you're reading this book, it's hugely instructive. The thing that came up over and over again was that human civilizations that have fallen have actually frequently done so despite causing that fall themselves and having the information at their fingertips that they were doing it. They still failed to incorporate that knowledge and do anything about it. And my favorite example of this is Easter Island. So, Easter Island is the landmass, the inhabited landmass that is farthest away from all other landmasses. And so it was inhabited by humans very late. It wasn't inhabited until 900 AD. And over the next 500 to 700 years, it was completely deforested. In fact, this is a quote from the book. It's the most extreme example of forest destruction in the Pacific, and among the most extreme in the world. The whole forest gone, and all of its tree species extinct. This is very surprising. Easter Island is not such a huge place. The inhabitants, the people who live there, would have been able to very easily see that this was happening. And those same inhabitants knew exactly what they used those trees for. They built canoes with them, and those canoes that they used to fish, they used them for fuel for fires. There were wild animals that lived there that they used for food sources and a part of the web. And also, the trees improved soil quality. They controlled erosion. So these trees were critical to life on Easter Island, and yet the inhabitants completely and totally deforested the island. And this is a painful sentence to read, but consequences included starvation, a population crash, and a descent into cannibalism. So humans don't turn to cannibalism unless things are real bad. And it's easy to kind of separate ourselves from this, to say that, like, that was different. But we today, as a society, are doing something that is eerily similar. This is a chart that you probably have seen some version of in the past. It is a chart of global mean temperature. And what you can see happening today with climate change is very much the same type of behavior that you could see happen over and over and over again in these civilizations that Jared Diamond talks about and maps out in his book. And I know that that's like, wow, we're getting pretty serious for a Tuesday morning. And I want to set realistic expectations here. I am by no means going to solve climate change in this talk, but it feels important to me because we are, like, our jobs as data professionals is to help large groups of people make good decisions. And it's clear that, like, on some fundamental level, we aren't that good at that. And so I want to spend some time thinking about, first, I have one more slide where I want to give you a test, and then I want to think about maybe how to see this problem a little differently. Okay, quick test. I will be very curious to hear answers in Slack after this is over. But what's something that you know personally is true that your organization isn't acting on? What's something your organization is doing that you think is a bad idea because of data you've seen? And what is the biggest existential threat to your organization? And do others agree with that? My guess is that you will probably have somewhat of a mixed bag here. Most organizations don't have perfect agreement on these topics, and the process there is very instructive as to what's going on. Okay, how do we create organizations that get out of the way of the train? That's the question that animates the rest of this talk. We're going to go all over the place: philosophy, technology, biology, and I'm already taking way too long, so I'm over time. So I'm going to jump right in. Let's start with philosophy. There's a statistical association in Wikipedia. If you go to any Wikipedia article and you click on the first link in that article, and then for every subsequent Wikipedia article, you also click on the first link. Within 7 clicks, 97% of all Wikipedia pages land you at philosophy. So let's just start there. Epistemology is the study of knowledge, and organizational epistemology is a tiny, tiny little field of how groups know stuff. From what I've been able to find, there are 2 full-length books on this topic, and there's about 24 academic papers on it. And by and large, I didn't find the field to have like very tactile like things that I could draw conclusions from. But there was one thing in particular that I found incredibly valuable. Here's a quote: "Knowledge is not compliance to any epistemological criteria, but simply what has been established and accepted." I had to read that line a couple times. I had to like run it through my real people language translator. But I think that what that line is actually trying to say is organizational knowledge is consensus. If it is widely understood by people throughout the organization, then you can say that the organization knows that thing. And this is like a thing that should be obvious, but if you're anything like me, you have probably at some point in your career made a dashboard that you thought was amazing, and you thought like did the perfect job of answering a question, and then nobody looked at it. And what this statement is saying is that regardless of how proud you were of that dashboard, if nobody looked at it, then it really was pretty worthless. It didn't impact behavior, it didn't do anything. And that's really the goal of all of this that we're up to. I really appreciate Joel sharing this screenshot, this collection of screenshots. I think it's super cool. This is a series of Slack messages. He did a search on what do you mean in his organizational Slack, and you see over and over again this like need to clarify like what would seem like basic concepts. What's the easiest way to get a figure on the number of licenses for each subject this year? Oof. When you say licenses, do you mean number of things sold? And this is the kind of thing that like all of us should be incredibly familiar with. If you have ever asked the question, what do you mean by day? You're in this territory. But you know, a day, it seems like it should be such a easily understood thing. But for organizations that operate in 24 time zones, there's no clear answer to that question. And so you have to agree on how you answer that question as an organization collectively. And data professionals are the ones that are building this reality up from like the very most fine-grained level of detail. So this is interesting, and I'm glad that we started there, but I don't feel like philosophy taught me like anything super tactile that said like, okay, how do we actually get to consensus? So the next place I went was communication technology. So I am interested in communication technology because the history of communication technology is the history of humanity. The history of humanity is our ever more evolution towards larger and larger groups of coordination. And you can map these capabilities these organizational structures directly to the communication technologies that we had available at the time. Because if 2 people can't communicate, they can't collaborate, they can't coordinate. And so it is our ability as a species to communicate and communicate very effectively with each other that enables us to work together and live together. So I'm going to go on a comically brief and high-level tour of history of communication technologies, starting with speech. I didn't know this until a week ago, but it turns out that the origin of human language is one of the hardest problems in science. Lots of people study it, but we can't seem to do much better than guessing that it was between 40 and 100,000 years ago. And this really directly maps to humans in tribes. This probably matches what you would expect, but humans in tribes used speech as their primary way of talking together. And the next major advance here was writing, and that really it did take a long time to evolve, but it was about 5,500 years ago now. And writing was a major part of the early city-state. Ancient Sumer, ancient Egypt, these societies often used writing to record commercial transactions. The next comically large jump I want to make is the printing press. Printing press was invented in 1440 AD, dramatically reduced the cost of printing books and other documents, and directly influenced the Reformation, the rise of democracy, and the scientific enlightenment. This communication technology makes huge impacts in society. The last major one that I want to call out here is the telegraph. And the telegraph is unique because it was the very first communication technology that traversed distances instantaneously. Previously, the fastest way to get a message anywhere was literally on a horse, but the telegraph enabled instantaneous communication wherever you could run wires to. And so it should not be at all surprising that the rise of the telegraph happened at the same time as the rise of geographically dispersed political and capitalist empires of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Like this is the when colonial empires, when corporate empires were like the largest that they've ever been. So from there we go to technologies that we still use today: telephone, radio, television, commercial internet. These are things that you're well familiar with. And as I thought of all of these communication media, I started to group them in a couple different dimensions. These are all of the instantaneous communication media. I feel like it's reasonably obvious why we don't want to continue to have the Pony Express as a main communication media in our society. But most of these are, well, so there's this like interesting dichotomy. The one-to-many media, radio and broadcast TV, really not available to that many institutions. You have to have pretty serious like equipment and technology in order to operate a radio station, operate a broadcast TV station. And up until the internet, all of the communication technologies that individuals and most organizations had access to were one-to-one. And so we've gone through this kind of, I'm gonna kind of put that on a shelf there. Like let's leave that for a second. But I want to ask the question, how do these communication technologies impact our organizations? We've kind of talked about that at the very highest level, but I want to drill in a little bit. And in thinking about how to answer that question, I started thinking about nervous systems. And I started thinking about graphs. So this is, everybody on this at this session should understand what this looks like. This is DBT Docs. This is Fishtown Analytics' internal DBT project, and it's our graph. It shows you how knowledge flows through our data pipeline. But there are other types of graphs, and I got super interested in the graph of nervous systems in animals. And there were two types of animals that in particular I really became obsessed with. The jellyfish, the salamander, both represent types of nervous system graphs. So the jellyfish, and I'm going to try to say it, the jellyfish is a part of a bunch of animals that are called cnidarians. There's a C at the beginning of that, but I think the C is silent. So 9,000 species have a similar nervous system layout. It's called a nerve net. In a nerve net, there's no central channel where information flows. The information is distributed around the animal, and it has to hop from place to place to place to place in order to get where it's eventually needed. In the salamanders, so the salamanders is an example of a chordate, or an animal with a central nervous system. But the exact opposite is true. There is a spinal cord with nerves that flow throughout the animal, and that spinal cord eventually terminates with the brain, which is where all of the decision making or majority of the decision making happens. And then the actions can actually be redistributed through the spinal cord through the animal. So these are two completely different topologies. And nature has determined that the chordate, the central nervous system body plan, is more effective simply because far more animals on the planet today have central nervous systems. So, okay, let's go deeper here. Let's think about what the layout of an information network has to say about how an organization works. Let's start by saying that each of these circles is a node in an information graph, and that each one is a human. So this is a group of 16 humans, and if you just kind of organically have them interact, this is typically what their interaction graph will look like. There will be some people who are more on the edges, some people who are more central, and it looks fairly haphazard. And this is when you are primarily facilitating communications in a one-to-one way. There are, you will not be surprised to find that this looks a little bit like the nerve net that we saw in the jellyfish. There's some problems with this. The first one is that in order to get the information from one end to the other end of this network, it takes 5 hops. The other one is that there's real skew in the connectedness of these different nodes. The 5 nodes that are circled here have 5 interconnections, and there are several others that only have 1, and some have 2. And just in the structure of this network, these 5 highly connected nodes have more power. And if you can think about this from the perspective of an organization, the humans that those nodes represent are going to have more organizational power. They're going to be able to translate the information as it passes through them. They're going to be able to decide when to slow down the transmission of certain information. These are not good properties of an information network. On the other hand, if you have a piece of communication technology that sits in the center that facilitates connections between everybody else in a one-to-many way, all of a sudden, your network looks really different. The max distance between any of these nodes is 1. It directly can message to everybody. And the connectedness skew is none. All nodes are connected to everybody else. And this is a very different way of organizing an information network. And it has real impacts. If you organize your network this way, it changes the amount of time that it takes to propagate information. It changes the likelihood that that information propagates losslessly, which significantly impacts trust in the network. And it reduces the amount of structural power that any given node can possess. So these have real impacts in how our organizations process information. And if you think about it, this should really map very closely to your experience of work, at least if your work history goes back prior to Slack. If I think about the early part of my career, which is not so long ago, but in the early 2000s, these are the tools that we had to communicate with each other. We had the phone. We printed out memos and we sent them in inter-office mail, which is like I had to delve deep into my memory banks to get that back. We actually printed reports and we put them in binders. Things were stored in file cabinets and we sent faxes to each other. I can't even tell you how happy it makes me that I do not send any faxes today. Of course, the internet comes along and you think everything's going to change, but what did people do? Well, they used email, and email is fundamentally a replacement for mail. It's still primarily a one-to-one communication technology. And they attached spreadsheets, PowerPoints, and Word documents to it, the killer app of the internet. So compare all of that information exchange to the ways that modern organizations exchange information. Slack, one to many, Notion, GitHub, Zoom, Asana. Like these are just examples. And I pull them because they're ones that we internally use at Fishtown Analytics. The modern data stack, all of these are one to many communication channels where any one human being can publish information for every one of their colleagues to consume. So let's put all of this like crazy journey that I just stitched together and see if we can put it together. If action requires knowledge and organizational knowledge requires consensus and consensus requires communication, but prior communication tech was one-to-one, then it shouldn't be that surprising that human organizations have been dysfunctional. They were thinking like jellyfish. The information had to hop, 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 hop. And that, jellyfish are still around today, but they're not really that capable. Nature has made it very clear that salamanders and their chordate siblings are the dominant life form on the planet, or the dominant animalian form anyway. The point of all of this long journey is that the modern data stack is not a better way to do data. It and other one-to-many communication media enables a new type of organization. That's like not really that clear. What do we do with that thought? How do organizations look different in a very practical way? How do you go about creating this new type of organization? Well, I think it's honestly a little bit of a singularity. Like this is a question about complexity, and we aren't going to know the answer until we can like look 50 years in the future and look backwards. But I have some ideas, and I absolutely believe that this list of ideas is not exhaustive, and I'm very curious to hear other folks' ideas as well. But I think that the first one, you have to prioritize trust. If you're going to think about your organization's information flow as this central nervous system, you have to be able to trust your senses. If you, as a human being, couldn't trust your sight and hearing, and touch, you would not be in great shape. You would not be well positioned to make effective decisions. There's pretty clear ways that we can go about doing this today, but many of these things also are going to be things that we have to figure out how to do over time. We do some automated testing today in our data pipelines. We have to do a lot more of it, and we have to do a lot more different types of it. We have to do great monitoring alerting. We have to have SLAs, and we have to be transparent about those SLAs and how well we're achieving them. We have to deprecate stuff that isn't current. We have to use all of the tactics from Google's SRE handbook, chaos engineering, disaster recovery planning. Like this thing has to work. If it is powering our organization, then we have to be very confident that it's going to continue to work. And there's another one that I think is interesting, that is like this big black box that I think we haven't seen too far into yet, but use social signals to build trust frameworks. So I think about this like how Airbnb created this trust framework that enabled humans to go literally stay in strangers' houses. Like that requires a tremendous amount of trust to take that leap. And Airbnb achieved that through the various mechanisms on its site that they have for establishing this trust between strangers. And I think that we're going to have to figure out how to do the same thing inside of our organizations. How do we know that something is trustworthy? I truly believe that one of the things that we're going to have to do is that every decision maker in the organization, these decision makers function as the brain of the organization. They all have to be able to plug directly into the spinal cord. And that certainly could be Notion or Asana, but it also significantly means the modern data stack. And I've talked about this before, but I think that there's still too often, a divide between people who have a set of technical skills, which many of us on this call do have, but there's a much larger group of decision makers that don't always have those technical skills and may not ever necessarily have the technical skills that we have. And in order to effectively plug into that nervous system, they can't have this intercessory relationship with it where they ask a data analyst and then that data analyst inquires into the data. They have to be able to directly have a conversation with that data themselves. If you have the experience of directly inspecting data and trying to find your way towards some nugget of truth, you will understand that it's not really possible to go on that process unless you can be in conversation with data directly. This means a lot about how data teams are built. Their data as a product, I think, is critically important. There need to be new analytical user interfaces that plug directly into the modern data stack and not act as silos, but they need to help individuals that don't have the same level of technical literacy. Their jobs are other things, to be able to have that conversation with the data. Learning and development to grow technical capabilities. And this is like the Notion or the wiki point. Invest in default public narrative knowledge tooling. The modern data stack is not the only thing that is enabling this. There's a tremendous amount of other types of knowledge that are being communicated in a one-to-many way right now as well. And especially with the transition to distributed teams, we're seeing companies invest more and more in that type of distributed knowledge. And everything that you do has to create institutional memory. At first, when I had a meeting with somebody from GitLab a couple of years ago, and they said, "Do you mind if I record this and then put the recording on YouTube?" And I thought that was so strange. Like, this is such a random meeting, and you're going to like record it and put it on YouTube. But I've come to see that as such an amazing and decision in the way that GitLab functions. And they were a pioneer here. Certainly more folks do this today, but making sure that everything that you do creates institutional memory is so critical, because otherwise time goes on, nobody else knows about it, and you find yourself back in this like negative information graph. Here's another one that I think doesn't get enough attention. I think that organizations of the future are going to need two decision-making pathways. And I think about this, if anyone has read Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, he talks about how humans have two decision-making pathways. They have system one, which is very fast twitch responses. It's not deliberative, it's very instinctual. But sometimes the decisions that it makes are still very sophisticated. And then there's system two. This is the cognitive, slower, deliberative process that helps humans make sense of things that they're not used to, that they don't necessarily have a predetermined response for. I think organizations need to evolve these same two flows. And I think that looks something like some threshold below which, if you are a decision maker and you have an appropriate level of data where you can be confident in the decision that you're making, you don't need consensus. The cultural norm should be that you can just go act on that information and just go do it. Consensus is slow and it takes time and it takes energy from large numbers of people. And so we should save our consensus making process for truly unknown and critical decisions that are like well above this threshold. But still, we need to work on our consensus making process as well. It can't happen via one-on-one walk and talks. It has to happen via a process that it looks more one to many. And I think that we have the opportunity to see that as the maintainers of DBT. There are these like very lengthy back and forths that happen in DBT issues in GitHub, and you realize that like anyone can participate in this process as long as they have interest and they have a little bit of time on their hands to weigh in. And so I think that looks more like what the consensus process will look like in the future. Finally, I think that cultural norms are really, really super important. We need to value transparency at all levels of the organization. I think that transparency has in the past felt like an organizational culture thing that some organizations did and some organizations didn't. I think that transparency in the future is going to be something that all organizations have to practice. Imagine being a human and having parts of your brain keep secrets from other parts. That's not a functional way to go about living your life. On some level, like we all have that. When you wake up from a dream and you realize, holy crap, I didn't even know that I had that thought in my head. But we should all aspire to have an integrated sense of self and decision making process. We also need to value epistemic humility. We need to understand that we don't know everything, and we need to have really clear boundaries on what we feel really confident about and what we do not know yet. And the fact that we don't know something yet isn't a slight, it's just a reality of the world. We don't know everything. And talking about information that way will help us understand and reality and arrive at consensus. We also have to create real psychological safety. If if there are parts of if there are humans in your organization that do not feel empowered to weigh in, you are not going to have the benefits of their expertise. And insofar as we all are trying to evolve this collective decision making process, then that's a real loss. And finally, we have to, there's a tendency, especially at startups where I'm very familiar, to always want to be shipping new things, producing new work. I think that culturally, we're going to have to take the time to prioritize knowledge formation activities, take the time to write things down, to make sure that other people know what you're doing and what you've learned and what they can take away from it. If you don't do that, you collapse back into this like one-to-one jellyfish style knowledge graph. So I know that that was really all over the place. I am as shocked as you are that I managed to do this in 40 minutes, but I really appreciate you taking the time to go on that journey with me, and I look forward to chatting more in Slack.